It's a real honor to be asked to give this study. Haven't lived in Israel for a while now, but those are truly some very fond years, and the friendships are deep and precious. And so it's an honor to be here with so many familiar faces and loved ones, and to know that we're part of a larger community in Jerusalem. And I expect the feelings are mutual. I've heard that, and that you guys also appreciate the connection that we have, that Joe and I have with you all. I'll say a quick prayer before we start. God of the universe, God of the Jewish people, God of the Messiah, Jesus, give me your words today, give me your wisdom, help me to articulate things that I've learned, and to really point to Jesus, who to me is the source of life. And we'll all give you gratitude for all the great things that you do. Amen. It's a little daunting to, for a couple of reasons, to start with this text. I'm thrilled to be looking at the resurrection of the widow's son, only son in Nain, which Gary asked me to do a while ago. And why it's daunting is because, one, I struggle with perfectionism, so there's no way I'm going to be able to, like, if we had 3 hours, I might be able to cover what I wanted to really set out to do today. So that's one part. That's a personal failing. A second thing is, in order to really approach this text properly, you actually need to understand the entirety of the Gospel of Luke. So I don't know how we're going to do that. I will try to get us there. And the third thing is, maybe there's 4 things. The third thing is, it's a great honor to be part of a series like this with some very people that I respect, look up to, and learn so much from. And so there's sort of that bit that always makes you a little bit nervous when you're involved in a group of this caliber, in a series of this caliber. And it's such a joy too, because you can finally dig into the text, dig into the original languages, look at how texts, the scriptures relate to one another. It's fantastic. For me, it's a thrill. And the fourth reason why I feel a bit nervous about this is, I'm talking about the Messiah. I'm talking about the person who I would never want to misrepresent in any possible light, but only want to give in the most appropriate light. So that makes me a little bit nervous, but I also have the confidence that he has, for some strange reason, found pleasure in joining me to his community and put his spirit in me and enabled me to have wisdom and ability to teach. So that's his prerogative. I will not fight him on that one. I'm going to share my screen with you. Oh, host disabled attendee screen sharing. Do you mind, Gary, letting me be able to do that?
Yes, I just have to figure it out.
No problem. While Gary does that, I'll say, in general, how I approach looking at a text like this, I don't tend to look at stories on their own. I don't usually do that. I want to understand where that story fits in the overall book I'm looking at. So with me today, you'll probably experience a lot more overview of Luke than you might normally get if someone were just looking at this particular miracle story. That's one thing. The second thing is that, oh good, I'm able to share screen. So here, I'll just show you this. This is my little mini outline of what I'd like to do. So we're looking at this story in Luke 7:11 through 17. So the resurrection of the widow's only child. We're going to read the story. Step 1, take a good look at it. Then we're going to read the story, consider it within the larger narrative of Luke. Then a really important step, we're going to try to understand this story's resonances within the Jewish scriptures, so the scriptures at the time of Jesus, the Hebrew Bible, and its interpretive traditions. I I have a subpoint here that we'll do a close reading then. We'll come back to our story, do a close reading of it again in light of the parallels that we've found. Really, that's probably where we'll end today. In a more robust study, we would definitely not want to miss out the opportunity to look at what the broader picture of Second Temple literature, so Jewish literature at the time of Jesus, what that lets us know about what people were thinking about healings, resurrections, prophets, Messiah figures, and so forth. I don't know how much. We may get a couple of texts in there at the end, is my guess. Unless people want to stay. It is Shavuot. We could study all night, and I could go for about 8 or 10 hours. It's all up to you, though, right, Gary? Okay, let's start with reading the text. And I'm recognizing right now that we're probably going to hear a lot of my voice, unless there's a way to do this interactively. But I'll start by reading this one myself. I'm going to pick the NRSV as my translation. Make this larger here, and I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, here we go. Are you ready? Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." It's on the other side here. Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. Now, I recognize that you can always go back and watch this again if you really, hey Danny, good to see you, man. If you really want to, I didn't see you before. If you really want to read that again, I would ideally like to read it twice in a row and just let's do it. Let's read it twice in a row, and you can always fast forward if you're watching this on a video. Would someone else like to read this? Gary?
Gemma's our reader. The official.
Gemma?
She's got that great British accent.
Can I read my version, or do you want me to read from the screen?
Let's read from the screen so that people who are watching later can follow.
Okay. So Luke 7:11, right?
Mm-hmm.
Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gates of the town, a man who died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Don't weep, do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably on his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country.
Okay, thank you so much, Jim. This is a spectacular story. There's so much to be said here. What stands out to you? You can just, if we can do this in a really quick fashion, sort of popcorn comments, could you just say anything that sticks out to you that, try not to make a sermon, just a sentence would work.
But she was a widow and it was her only son.
Yeah, the same thing struck me, and the fact that basically she's not only lost her working husband, but she's now lost her potentially working son who's going to keep him going. Keep her going, I mean.
So it resonates with Elijah.
The other thing that struck me when I was reading it earlier was the fact that he touches the bier, because there's a huge, great thing in the Jewish world about not touching the dead and who's allowed to touch the dead and so on.
I'm noticing the geography that it's just right around the corner from Shunammite, where Elisha raised the child. And so they're saying, oh, they're probably making that connection. Look at another great prophet near us.
So Nain is near where?
Near Shunammite.
I thought, well, we can have that discussion later. That'd be.
Jesus also in Luke 4 alludes to one of Elisha's, miracles. So it would fit the context of Luke.
Mm-hmm.
They're both on different sides of the hill of Moreh.
Any and all other comments, if anyone else who hasn't spoken, just give a quick sentence of something that stuck out to you is totally fine.
Obviously, the phrase great prophet is a curious thing. What are we talking about here?
Jesus' mother is also a widow, so he's personally had that experience of being with somebody who's gone through that drastic life change.
That's not clear in the Gospel of Luke, I would say, but that is interesting food for thought.
The other connection is Lois talked about this phrase "great prophet" being a food for thought, and it strikes me that it's equally odd that God has looked favorably on his people. I mean, where does that come from? This guy's been risen from the dead. I mean, it's being generalized to his people. I mean, I can understand Mama is thrilled to bits, and I can understand the village is pretty overwhelmed, but it's a sort of generalized holy line. It's a very odd line.
In my ESV, it says God has visited his people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it tells you a special word is being used here that's being translated in various ways.
Yeah, I've got visited too.
So I appreciate thank you everyone who has contributed there. I think we've got comments from I can't see everyone's names now that the screen is so small, but Gemma, Lois, Marcia, and can't remember. What was your name?
Monica?
Monica. Okay, thank you so much. So yeah, those things stick out to me as well. Another thing that sticks out to me is the use of Jesus showing compassion. You don't often get a glimpse into Jesus's inner life. You do in this story. Another thing is the fear that sees them. That also sticks out to me. Something further would be this word spreading throughout the entire country. And yeah, it's already been mentioned that he is his mother's only son. Now, before we go on to really dig our teeth into that text, we're going to go pull back and look at the broad picture of Luke. Tell me what you know about Luke in just a couple of sentences. How does it start? How does it build its story? Where does the tension come in? What is it about? It's about Jesus. It's about, his life. But more specifically, tell me how that story gets told.
it gets directed to the Kohen Hagadol of the time, Theophilus, that we think through Flavius Josephus is Yedidia, and he wants to.
So it's directed at the beginning to a most excellent Theophilos. I'm not convinced who the identity of that person is, but it's certainly it's written in a register that should be for somebody who is. It says that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been instructed about. So somebody who is fairly well informed. It's written for people with some sort of background. But tell me about the story arc. You know how the story opens. You know what's in there, not in Matthew, what's not in John. Tell me what you know about the story arc.
Well, you've got the prophecy of his birth. You've got the whole build-up to his being born, basically. And then you've got the whole issue of John the Baptist coming in as a sort of
forerunner.
Right.
Well, yeah, I wasn't going to say a forerunner. It's almost like another what's the word? Installment of the problem, installment of the story, really, another chapter. It sort of comes in. But all the way through, you're getting a throwback somewhere to be. You're getting an echo all the time of a prophecy, if you like, of referring back to something that's going to happen. I mean, but it's particularly true with John the Baptist. But I always thought that as the whole story develops, this particular story now is really a completely new chapter. We've just had the whole of 6, which is really almost like a discipleship lecture all the way through for who's really following and who's not. And now suddenly we're going into sort of what you might call the big time, and we're getting much more dramatic stories. I mean, to move from the withered man's hand in the synagogue to raising the dead a few weeks later or a few days later is pretty dramatic stuff. And it's sort of gaining impetus all the time.
Yeah, great points. Let's do this. I appreciate all of that, and I'm going to just add some of my own thoughts here and spell it out a bit more. So Luke opens with a bunch of predictions. Can everyone see this screen okay? Is the font large enough? That's not too bad.
Yeah, we have to move our faces off, but that's okay.
You can also move the faces off to the side and still see people's in the gallery view. So don't miss out on seeing one another in the gallery view. So you've got a bunch of predictions. The first one is, how does the story open? The very first story.
The prophecy of the birth of Jesus.
The prophecy of the birth of John the Baptist.
Sorry, of John the Baptist.
So we have Gabriel to Zechariah. Then we have a story of Gabriel speaking to Mary. Then we have a story of Mary and Elizabeth coming together. And we have Mary's fantastic song here. Whoops, typing is a problem. Then what do we have after that? Well, what happened in the opening scene? In the opening scene, Gabriel announces, what does he announce to Zechariah? That John the Baptist that a son will be born. What do we know about this son? What's so special about this son? I like interaction so much, but I feel for this the case of speed, I'm gonna plow in here. Well, first of all, it's a miraculous birth because Elizabeth has been barren. But this fella, the son, is going to prepare the way of the Lord. And he's going to do this by, it's largely, I would say it's largely a positive tone. However, or let's say hopeful, it's an entirely hopeful tone. He will prepare a people for the Lord, prepare a people. But yet there is some solemnity to it, let's say, because he will also bring about Israel's repentance. And then we have this crazy ending where Zechariah, how does he respond? Oh, great. The Lord is great. Let's do this. No, he says, I don't even know if this is gonna really take place. And so he becomes mute. It's an important point for us. He will not be able to speak. He will not be able to talk about what God is going to do. This is a Kohen at the height of he's old in age, at the height of his wisdom, at the height of everything that he has going in his life. He's in the temple. The entire narrative begins in the temple with the angel Gabriel announcing God's great plan for humanity, and it meets with human resistance at the epicenter of the world of Jesus's people. In contrast, when he comes to Mary, Mary receives the message. She is also afraid, and he says, do not be afraid. Yet she is receptive to the message, and in the end, she has a great blessing that's given to her. And let's see if I can just cut and paste. Maybe that'll be better. The promise is that God will give David's throne to Mary's child. He's to be called Son of the Most High. He will rule over Jacob's house, and his kingdom will not end. So we move from a sort of generic God will prepare a people, John will prepare a people for the Lord, to very specifically that David.
Can I ask you something, Jordash? Can I ask you something? I've never seen that contrast before between basically Zechariah being muted because of his doubts, if you like, and the opposite to Mary. Am I right in seeing that as such a
absolutely
contrast?
Oh, because she bursts out in song. First of all, she says, let it be to me, I'm the Lord's servant, let it be to me according to your word. She has this promise that her child will be on David's throne. So now we have a very specific kind of concept of what is going to be happening in the narrative.
It just struck me as amazing, the amazing contrast. I mean, we all know the Magnificat, but I never put the two together. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, it's absolutely fine. It is, and it's meant to, Luke often stylizes things this way. He'll put one story right beside another. You'll see this at the opening where Jesus speaks in two synagogues in chapter 4. The first one in his hometown, the next one is in Capernaum. And in the one in Nazareth, he says, you're going to surely say to me, do here what you did in Capernaum. So they're already internally, those two stories are also linked. This happens very frequently in Luke. It's important. And so Gabriel appears to two different people. The contrast is quite significant. The one becomes mute at the end. But the promises themselves are dovetailing, and it's a promise about what will be happening later. It's the salvation that's coming. And thanks, Gemma, for that. Note also that I should mention that in both of these stories, I don't know how we're going to fill this all in. I should have mentioned here that he will be filled with the Spirit at birth, this child, and this child will be conceived by the Spirit. So this is another important linking point between these two children that are about to be born. Again, this is entirely positive, everything that we're getting in Gabriel's announcement to Mary. The next scene is we have this encounter where Mary goes and visits Elizabeth. I'm just skipping over tons of details because I assume you know all these stories, but I'm highlighting the bits that I think are important because of the thread that's going through the narratives. And sometimes if you read these stories only in the context of, say, Christmas, and you only compare it with what's in Matthew 1 and 2, you're actually missing, I'd say, the lifeblood of what these stories are about. Luke 1 and 2 are meant to open the door and show you the way for the rest of the gospel, right? That's really what the primary context where those should be read. Mary's song is very hopeful. How am I going to put that in there? And it talks about a great reversal, including Mary's own exaltation, the proud being humbled. And let me put a few more points in here. The great reversal also involves, why did this is not doing it the way I wanted to. Oh, well. God's showing mercy to his people, God as the savior and deliverer. So now in Gabriel's speech to Mary, we heard about David, this child being on David's throne, but now we're actually hearing of deliverance and salvation. We're even hearing of God's acts of might, which may affect national matters. So powers being deposed from thrones, the scattering of the proud, God working might with his arm. These are the types of phrases that you would expect if there's going to be perhaps armed conflict, or at least the elimination of national enemies, or if not national enemies, perhaps Herod the Great himself is being targeted in some of these predictions, that the mighty will be deposed from their thrones and the true king will be installed in Israel. These are fighting words, so to speak. These are not just peace on earth to those in whom God is pleased and angels with pixie dust. It's not that kind of a story. I don't have time here to bring in one other thread in detail, but what I'd like to do is go back to here. When Gabriel speaks to Zechariah, he says, your prayers have been answered. A son will be given to you in Elizabeth, and it's going to be there's going to be lots of joy in Israel on account of him. You would think that Zechariah would respond with joy. He doesn't. And we don't get that joy. We don't get the joy until this episode. When Mary sees Elizabeth, John, the child in her, leaps with joy at the appearance of Mary. So the son of Zechariah is doing what Zechariah ought to have done, which is to respond with joy. And at that moment, the child inside Elizabeth is filled with the Spirit. The prophecy that was also given to Zechariah is taking place. But it's taking place, so to speak, now with Zechariah out of the picture. So these are strange things. The people that have been announced to in the opening scene, this great leader is not seeing the fulfillment of things per se and is not involved in them per se, and yet the joy is taking place not in the temple and not among not in the establishment and in the way that you might have hoped that it had happened, and certainly Gabriel seems to have wanted it to happen that way. Joy is mixed with praise in this third scene here, and that will be very significant as time goes on, that the joy is mixed in with praise. Wish I had more time to really look at these stories with you, because it's so crucial how Luke builds these first 5 or 6 episodes at the very beginning. It's unique to Luke, and it sets the stage for really everything else that follows in the gospel. And if we haven't done our homework, if we haven't really sunk our teeth into the opening, it's hard to know that we're going to follow what's coming after that. Chuck, do you have a question? No? Okay, just checking. What happens next is the child is born. The child is born, and you know what happens then. His tongue is loosened, and he begins to praise God. So he is also, if we accept now that praise and joy have been merged together, he begins to finally participate in the joy that Gabriel announced at the very opening. He not only that, he also prophesies. And what does he prophesy? Again, something that's entirely hopeful. just cut and paste this here. I think this will be the easiest way to do this. So his prophecy is hopeful. It has a nationalistic focus, just like we saw earlier with Mary. And it has a focus on salvation. It talks about God visiting his people. So Lois brought this up in the story in chapter 7. And here we have it twice mentioned in Zechariah's great prophecy, which is the fourth of 5 or maybe 6 opening scenes where there are predictions that then get later fulfilled in the following narrative. This is not working here. Oh well, not sure what to do with that. But I'll just leave those bullets they're not working the way I want them to. And this visitation is linked with the compassion and mercy of God. Διασπλάχνα ελέους Θεού ημών εν ους επισκέψετε ημάς ανατολέ εξ ύψους. We know from the Hebrew Bible that the fact that God is compassionate and gracious is central. So in Exodus 34, Adonai, Adonai, El Rahum V'Hanun, El Chapayim V'Rav Chesed V'Emet, Notzer Chesed V'Alafim V'Notzer Chesed V'Alafim V'Nosei Avon V'Fesha V'Hata'ah. The Lord, the gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness. And that seems to be drawn upon here. It's drawn upon many, many times, even in the context where you wouldn't expect it. For example, and other people will know this much better than I do, because they teach the book of Jonah, but when Jonah comes and prophesies destruction on Nineveh, and it doesn't happen, he's very upset, and he sits outside, and he's bummed out that the destruction did not take place, and when God's, he says to God, I knew it, and this is why I ran away from you in the first place. I knew that you're the Lord, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, etc. I knew this, and I knew that you would relent on your anger, and I didn't really want to have to be a prophet for you, because you're gonna let me down because you're too compassionate. That theme comes throughout the. It's also in Psalm 145. It's in a bunch of places. It's repeated over and over. And we can imagine that has its resonances here. We again get the notion of redemption, salvation, and not only salvation now, but also from our enemies and those who hate us. So we sort of see an escalation of the type of hopes that are being articulated by these characters, in these characters' mouths, in the key scenes at the opening of the narrative here.
Jordash?
Yeah.
You might want to add where in Luke 1, where you're focused on there with the mercy, splachna eleos.
Okay. Yeah, where is that? Just a sec.
Just for people taking notes.
Yeah. Okay. What I'll do, just a sec here.
You mean in verse 54, remembering his mercy?
178. 1 verse 78. Okay. So far so good. And also, of course, we get the mention of the house of David. There's also another note of solemnity, because he again responds, he again speaks of his own son, saying that there will be repentance involved. So it's not merely deliverance from enemies and so forth. There's also an element of something is not right and needs to be changed here. But generally, the entire tone is hopeful. After that, we get the story of the birth of Jesus. So we've had Gabriel to Zechariah, Gabriel to Mary, the account of Mary and Elizabeth. We've had Zechariah's prophecy at the birth of John, and now we have the birth of Jesus. And I'll say the angel of the Lord and host at the birth of Jesus. This again is entirely positive. we get another announcement of great joy. So this is quite a theme for angelic announcements in the gospel. And we've seen how joy was linked with praise earlier between Elizabeth and Mary. Yes, Elizabeth and Mary. This is for all the people. A Savior is born. Again, this is the Mashiach. This is a descendant of David. It's in the city of David. And this host speaks of peace on earth. Now, note in this context, the peace on earth, if it's coming through a Messiah, and in context, in light of what we've already heard, it's probably going to involve a significant change of the existing social order, the world order of powers. It's not just peace that comes suddenly with magical fluff. Something has to happen. Something drastic has to happen in order for the Messiah of Israel to have power in order to enforce peace on earth. That's how the prophecies go in many places, Isaiah 9, Isaiah 11, and so forth. Yet there are two aspects here that make this, it's still entirely positive, but there's something curious going on here. There's a curious sign. This Messiah will be found in a feeding trough. He's going to be born and found among animals. Very strange. This is not anything you would expect from prophecies about the Messiah, the descendant of David. It shows something about the humility and unexpectedness of what is going on here. And the other thing would be, another curious thing is the curious emissaries. These shepherds are sent to be the announcers of this great news about the birth. It's also very strange. We're no longer in the temple. We had an announcement in the temple to Zechariah. Now we have an announcement by an angelic messenger to very unlikely recipients. So something is changing in the narrative as it unfolds. Now we come to the sixth and final and quite surprising encounter. This is the one with Simeon in the temple. Jesus is going in to be to have the offering done just after his birth. And what's interesting is that this sixth voice, this sixth key figure that makes predictions that are expected to take place in the following narrative, has both positive and negative aspects. The positive aspect is, again, things that are along the same themes that we've already expected or already become familiar with. Glory for the people of Israel and salvation for these people. And at the same time, there's perhaps two twists. The first twist would be that he will be a light for the Gentiles as well. Well, that's strange. Whatever we've heard about the Gentiles so far has not been entirely positive. And the second one is that he will actually raise opposition within Israel. He will cause the rising and falling of many within Israel. This is perhaps the greater twist. So far, the people of Israel have been spoken of collectively. Salvation has been for our people, for the promises made to our fathers. But now we hear that he's going to be assigned to be spoken against, and he will cause rising and falling. So we've already heard about Zechariah and how he didn't respond, but then later he was able to speak. So there's hope for people. There's hope for people that initially are not receptive and later have a change of heart. And there's one more aspect to this second twist, and that is as Simeon seems to speak personally to Mary and say that a sword will pierce her own heart. Something very strange is going to take place in relation to this predicted deliverer figure, and we're not quite sure what that is. Of course, if you know the story, you know what it is, but I'm saying as the narrative unfolds, you're not quite sure what that is. Okay, I think we started at 10:15, right, Gary? I don't know how long this study is supposed to go.
I'd say you got about 10 to 15 more minutes.
It's going to be awkward. Okay, here we go. So that's par for the course with me, but you get to learn to live with yourself and experience grace and power through you, even though you have many shortcomings. That's what you do. To summarize that part of the narrative, we have 6 key encounters with figures that make predictions. We have Gabriel to Zechariah, Gabriel to Mary, Mary's song in her encounter with Elizabeth. We have when Zechariah's prophecy, when his mouth is loosened. We have the angel of the Lord speaking to the shepherds, also the host. And then finally, we have Simeon in the temple. Only in the last one do we get this twist, 2 twists really. The Messiah will also somehow be a light to the Gentiles. And not everything is as hopeful as we had once thought. Yes, before there was an element of solemnity because the son of Zechariah and Elizabeth was supposed to bring about repentance in Israel, but now we realize that there's actually going to be a division within the nation. Some will rise and some will fall, and Jesus, or this child to be born will also be, that is born rather, will be a sign to be spoken against. And we hear that there will be a sword that will pierce Mary's heart. Very strange opening. Exultant, triumphant in so many ways, and yet there is this last gong, this last tone, dissonant tone that's hit at the end of this opening sequence that will reverberate throughout the text. John the Baptist is born, goes out into his public ministry. He speaks of one that will come after him. He baptizes with water. This other person, the coming one, will baptize with the Spirit. Jesus has the Spirit come upon him when he's baptized. When he has his first public speaking event at his own hometown in synagogue. Although it's not necessarily chronologically the first one, it's the one that Luke has put first. We know it's not Jesus' first activity because in that story, as I've already mentioned, he will say, why don't you're going to try to tell me to do in Capernaum, do here what I've already done in Capernaum. So there's an assumption that Jesus has already been active to some extent. But nevertheless, this is the first active story in Jesus' ministry that's put out there. He does mention the Gentiles in there. He mentions how Elisha healed Naaman, the Syrian of leprosy, and how Elijah took care of a widow in Tzalfat, in Sidon. Then, and he's not. I mean, this is a very strange story. Also, to put at the opening of his ministry, he's not accepted warmly there. Let's put it that way. He goes on to Capernaum and speaks in the synagogue there. A better reception, and he is able to cast out a demon from someone there. But nevertheless, the demons know more about him than the people do. The people are amazed at his teaching and so forth, but the demons know who he is, and he is at a number of points continuing to tell them not to speak. There are other healings that take place. At one point in chapter 5, leaders from throughout the Jewish world, from Judea, the Galilee, from all over, are in at one particular location. He heals a man from a paralytic, and there is a positive response to some extent by many of the people there, but others are extremely frustrated with him and oppose him for things that he says. This type of mixed, somewhat acceptance and somewhat rejection it's resonating with the tones that have already been set in motion throughout the opening stories. We come to, there's another one with the healing of the shriveled hand, which Gemma pointed to. This one, there's a very strong disagreement with what Jesus is doing, a very strong negative reaction to him by some. Then we come to his teaching in chapter 6 of his disciples. a large group of disciples. So he has a number of people that are following him and aligned with him. And after that, he comes again into Capernaum, and this Gentile requests a healing. This is the first time that he has an encounter with a Gentile like this in the Gospel of Luke. And normally what's happened in the miracle stories is after a miracle takes place, people say something positive or make questions or have fear or so forth. And in this case, before the miracle even takes place, Jesus himself is amazed. We rarely hear of Jesus' amazement. But here in the beginning of chapter 7, Jesus himself is amazed, turns to the crowd and says, I haven't found this kind of faith even in Israel. It's a strange tone, but it has some resonances. It has some, there's a harmonic aspect to it with what Simeon had said earlier. Then we come to our story, which we will return to finally. Whoops, that's not the right one. Where was it? There it is. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearer stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably or visited his people." This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. Gemma, I like Gemma's point that this is really an apex of the types of miracles that we've seen Jesus perform so far in the unfolding story. And this compassion was already alluded to a number of times in the opening stories. One of them was Zechariah's own prophecy, where he says that God will look with favor upon his people because of his mercy. He also uses the word tasplankna, which is what it says here about Jesus. And the people themselves, once they become afraid, also say God has visited his people. This visiting also appeared twice, was referred to twice in those opening scenes. So this would all seem like, yeah, people are starting to get it. This is a very positive assessment of Jesus. However, it won't take long before we get to the story where John the Immerser is asking questions, saying, "Are you the coming one, or should we be looking for somebody else?" And Jesus will cite the miracles that he's doing, the healings that he's doing in particular, healing the blind, raising the dead, and so forth. And he will be bringing together a number of texts, primarily Isaiah 61, but a number of texts together. We also see this, by the way, in the text from Qumran, the 4Q 521, which is sometimes called the Messianic Apocalypse. Basically, it's a pastiche of texts about healing that would be associated with God's great activity at the end of time, the age of salvation. Whether or not that figure in 4Q 521 is a Messiah figure or a prophet or something else is a question we can talk about another time. But what Jesus's answer that he will give to John the Immerser is not entirely a novel one. It seems like there are other exegetical traditions that bring those types of texts together. But what is entirely unique about it is that Jesus is saying this is happening right now. It's not something to be happening in the future. This is taking place, and implicitly, I'm the one involved here. I'm the agent involved. Herod also shortly after here, Herod will ask, who is this? Is this a prophet? You know, some people say he's a prophet, some people say this. Later, Jesus will ask the disciples towards chapter 9 and towards the transfiguration in chapter 9, he'll say, who do people say that I am? Some say a prophet, some say this figure, that figure. Who do you say that I am? You are the Messiah. This is what Simon will say, and Jesus will affirm that. And we understand that the voice from heaven, which is the definitive voice that comes shortly after that in the transfiguration, will say, this is my son, this is my son, my chosen one, listen to him, probably bringing in the prophecy about hen avdi etmoch bo behiri ratzta nafshi, this is my servant in whom I am well pleased. This is my servant, the chosen one. I've put my spirit on him. And again, that's going back to the baptism where the Spirit comes upon Jesus, and God also says, you are my son. So the son being used there as a messianic title. So if we return to our story here, a great prophet has risen among us. Pretty good, but not adequate. And definitely not a bullseye. Later, we're going to find out, as the greater narrative unfolds, who Jesus is. And Jesus, at the moment that he is actually correctly identified as the Messiah by Simon, he will immediately flip that over and go, the Son of Man must be rejected by the elders and the high priests and the scribes and be killed, and on the third day he will rise. So even his concept of what it means to be the Messiah has this really significant twist in it that we've already seen from Simeon's voice. We've covered so little. If I could only tell you so little of what I wanted to get through. What I really want to do, I think I maybe have 5 minutes left. What's crucial here, how do they get to this notion of the great prophet has risen among us? Early in our discussion, we talked about Elisha and Elijah. Elisha and Elijah, the stories about them are often told in parallel. So, Elijah raises someone from the dead, so does Elisha. Elijah provides food at a time of scarcity, so does Elisha. Elijah takes a mantle and crosses the Jordan, so does Elisha. In fact, Elisha is known to be Elijah's successor, so it makes sense. It is also known that Elijah is modeled after Moses. This is very, seems to be very conscious type of modeling. We can't go into it in any detail at all right now, but take me on my word or dialogue with me about it at another time. What's important to note is that the two stories of resurrection with Elijah and Elisha happen to be with only children. They not only happen to be with only children, they happen to be with a mother of only children. In the case of Elijah, it's a widow. In the case of Elisha, there is a man involved, but he's almost oblivious to what's going on. He doesn't really even know that his son is dead when his wife takes off to go get help from Elisha. Also, there are a number of points of parallels. I don't know why we've stopped screen sharing, but there are a number of points of parallels with our story here. There was a mention that the location is so the Shunammite, this is the woman whose son Elisha raises in 2 Kings 4, is in roughly the same area. Another thing that we should know is that both of those stories end up with very, very infrequently do these miracle stories that are relatively minor miracles. They're not of national scope for Elijah and Elisha. Rarely do they have a response, but these two resurrection stories do have responses. So in the case of Elijah, the woman says, now I know that you are truly a man of God and the word in your mouth is true. In the case of Elisha, she bows down and takes her son. There are other points of parallelism. Touches an extremely important point in those two stories. Elijah comes and spreads himself out on top of the boy. Elisha does a very similar type of activity. Here, Jesus touches the bier. He does not touch the man, but he does touch the aspect of touches involved. There's something else that's very similar between Elijah and Elisha's stories. Prayer is quite a significant aspect of what they do prior to the resurrection taking place. And if we look in this story, Jesus does not pray at all. In fact, all that he does is he touches and he speaks directly to the boy. So there's a way that there is a sort of leveling up in this story. For those who are reading and are aware, and as we heard earlier, Luke is writing to an audience who he expects to have background in the Jewish scriptures, these things would stand out. And implicitly, the informed reader would be able to look at the story and go, no, there's something different about this story. And there's one more thing. The level of pathos, the level of feeling in the Elijah and Elisha stories on the part of the women, the bereft women, is significant. In the story of Elijah, she says to Elijah, to the prophet, did you come here to remind me of my sin? What are you doing? Oy vavoy. And you've killed my son. In the Elisha story, the Shunammite woman comes. Elisha sends out Gehazi to greet her, and he says, is everything okay with you, with your husband, with your son? She's like, it's fine. And then she comes to Elisha, and she's like, this is bonkers. Why did you do this to me? I never wanted a child. You're the one who said God's going to give you a child. What have you done to me? And now, and Elisha doesn't even respond. He just says to Gehazi, run. If anyone greets you, don't say a word to them. Get yourself to that house immediately and put my staff there to heal this guy, to raise this guy. That doesn't work. Elisha has to come himself. He closes the door, and he's in kind of this angst that God will do something there. The pathos is absolutely significant and is very powerful, potent in those two stories. But in this story, it's also potent, but it's different. It's internalized in Jesus. We see that he is the one who has compassion here. We don't hear about the woman's experience. So the thematic content is the same, but we get a view of Jesus's inner world, his inner world of thought and feeling, which is rare, as we mentioned earlier about Jesus. So there's ways that this story is playing off of familiar stories. Don't get me wrong. Jesus has the power to raise someone from the dead. I have no problem with that. I'm just talking about the way the story is being told. The way that the story is consciously being narrated is invoking those other stories, and yet telling it in such a way that the informed listener is saying, oh, you got my attention here. I mean, yeah, a great prophet has risen, but this is much more than a great prophet. This prophet didn't even pray for a resurrection. There's very few resurrection stories in the Hebrew Bible. We know of Ezekiel 37. Whether this is talking about national redemption, so much is involved. God speaks to the prophet prophesies. There's this massive involvement of God in the process. Same with the stories of Elijah and Elisha, as we just talked about. But when it comes to this story, where is God? They glorified God at the end. God has looked favorably on his people, but that's coming from the people's voice. Where we see Jesus acting, he is acting directly as the agent of God without any reference or invocation of God, if that makes sense. Again, the way the story is being told is potent. There's an activity of Jesus that is unparalleled. It is unparalleled in the Jewish scriptures, and that should send a message to us going, yeah, a great prophet has risen among us, true, but more than that. And this very point will be underscored with the thickest possible marker in the Transfiguration, because who's there? Well, Moses and Elijah, some of the greatest prophets of all time, including someone who brought someone back from the dead. And when Peter wants to, or Simon and the others want to associate Jesus with them and put them on the same level, that's when the voice from heaven comes and says, you know, this is my son, listen to him. The listen to him does draw on the Deuteronomy prophecy about one like Moses. It does do that, but it also says he's significantly beyond Moses. That's the claim in that transfiguration story. Summarizing everything, what do we take from this story? What can we take away? And I'm sorry we didn't cover the stuff that I left out another time. What do we take away from this?
It strikes me just how Gemma mentioned there at the beginning about how it's kind of an odd point about them recognizing that this is significant on a national level. God has sent someone to redeem us as a people. Like, what an odd thing. This is something very local, very personal, heal the person. But in the context that you just very succinctly portrayed it, in that every little detail here is a very serious ramping up of a level in comparison to a Moses and to an Elijah and to an Elisha. Every single detail is a very kind of conscious referencing back to these highest of figures and saying, no, this is a very significant step up from that. So then that is very much the reaction. Oh my goodness, the people saying, oh my goodness, this is a prophet. Oh my goodness, this has national ramifications. He's not, okay, he just healed a person. Whoa, that's huge. Like you just said, that's very rare, even for the entire scope of the Bible. And oh my goodness, this must just, this person, this deed that he has just done, but this person must have ramifications for us as an entire people. We're at the cusp of something really revolutionary. Like that's what that statement is. So they haven't maybe yet fully recognized it, because they're saying, is this a prophet? Okay, like they haven't, like you said, they didn't hit the bullseye. This is the Messiah that we've waited for. Here we are, boom, we're home, like we've, home run. But there is a very serious kind of realization that wow, we're on the cusp of greatness.
I think that phrase, Danny, of ramping up is just extraordinary, because all the time, it's in recent weeks, months, maybe years already, I've begun to understand that the whole of the New Testament, particularly the Synoptic Gospels, I've always called it an upgrade. You're not to commit adultery, it says one end, and now it says you even look at somebody and you're committing an adultery. It's upgrading it. And this is a really brilliant example of that sort of upgrade or ramping up in a very specific story. It's not just a generalized sort of, be gooder than the guys before. I mean, going back to the whole story of Elijah and Elisha or Moses or whatever, it's just extraordinary, and I've never seen it before.
Well, and thank you for both those points. I concur. And what I would add, and what's so surprising to me, is the humility with which the Messiah appears on the scene and continues to operate time and time again when people don't fully appreciate. Have you ever been frustrated when you're skilled or something and people don't appreciate that about you? Have you ever found yourself in a conversation where someone doesn't recognize your ability to evaluate the situation and contribute or whatever? Can you imagine living your entire career being significantly underestimated, significantly undervalued the entire time, even by your closest associates? And that's the picture that we see here. It begins with the sign, the great sign. What is the great sign of the Messiah in Luke that the angel of the Lord declares? You'll find him in a feeding trough. this is the sign. This will be the sign to you in the city of David. Oh, wow, great sign, very impressive. And yet this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of announcement about the Messiah that Luke, we don't find this in Matthew. We don't find the same sort of thing. I mean, in Matthew, the Magi from the east come and honor him with very expensive, elaborate gifts. That's how that story opens. He also says at the very end, I'm with you always, and I'm sending you out to make disciples of all the nations. That's sort of the inclusio with that story. This story is a little different. It's not that elements aren't common to both. Of course, there's many common elements, but here, one of the things that Luke absolutely wants us to grasp is that the kingdom of God, which is coming through Jesus, can be totally overlooked. It's that powerful, but yet so you could miss it if you just glance and you think, oh, what was that? And you just continue on with your day, you'll absolutely miss the kingdom. It is there and it's striking. It's like the burning bush. If you don't pull aside to take a look, you'll miss the entire thing. But the bush was on fire and it wasn't being burned up. It's up to you. Are you going to listen? And so I think in this story, we get a really good glimpse of this massive work of God that's done for a widow. The way that it's done recalls some of the most powerful stories of the Hebrew Bible for prophets, and yet shows that this figure is greater than those that came before him, or is being portrayed as greater. It's up to you to choose if he's greater, but being portrayed as though he's greater. And what will you do with that information? And as the story goes on, like I said, he will accept the attribution of being the Messiah. And even don't forget, even John the Immerser was really confused. Like, should we be waiting for someone else? I mean, I really don't get it. I see what's been going on, but this isn't. I mean, I was prophesying that the guy who was coming after me would have a winnow's fork and he would be sifting the wheat from the chaff. And I don't see any sifting. I don't see a great judgment coming to separate who's in and who's out in Israel. And yet it is happening, but it's happening as Simeon says, it's a sign to be spoken against, who will reveal the hearts of the people. And this is what's happening with Jesus. Through Jesus' activities, he's revealing people's hearts, whether or not it's visible or invisible, the hearts are being revealed. And it's very, very much like the prophecy that God gave to Samuel. Listen to this one. You'll remember this. ויאמר אדוני אל שמואל, אל תבט אל מראהו ואל גבוה קומתו, כי לא אשר יראה האדם, כי האדם יראה לעיניים, ואדוני יראה ללבב. This is when God speaks to Samuel, Samuel's going to pick one of Jesse's older sons, and God's like, no, not that one. Because God doesn't look at appearances, God looks at the heart. And this is exactly the type of, this theme will get reverberated in later prophecies. It comes up in Isaiah 11. You know, the one about the rod from Jesse. Again, calling on the Jesse story. This one. It says later, Velo lemar'ei einayim yishpot. Velo I think I'm citing it properly, but you'll get the thing, even if I've got the words slightly mixed up. He will not judge with the seeing of his eyes, and he will not velo hochiach velo lemishma oznav yochiach. I think that's how it goes. But that whole concept of God is looking at people's hearts. God is not primarily looking at outward appearances. And what you can be a priest in the temple and doing the most significant task, but you may be missing it. And you may be a nobody who's unmarried and socially insignificant, but the greatest thing ever may be about to happen through you and in your life. And the question, I guess, from the story that we're pulling out, which has much better, a broader resonances throughout the entire narrative, but speaks to us in our lives, is don't be afraid. Just like Gabriel said to Zechariah and then to Mary, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of what's going on in your life. Don't be afraid of how insignificant you feel. because the Messiah is at work even in your small life. And our lives as disciples, the Messiah is at work. And some people aren't going to understand, and some people are going to overlook and not get it, but his power is still present, and we have to trust him long term for people getting it, for the fruit being, I mean, imagine how long he had to wait. Even his closest disciples didn't get it in the narrative, not until chapter 24, the very, very, very end, when finally, after he ascends, they go back into the temple and they are praising God. So we have an inclusio for all of Luke, because the disciples go back to the temple and they praise God with joy, which is what Gabriel prophesied in the opening words. So sometimes it takes a long time. Don't give up hope, and let's keep doing what we've been called to do.